But what are the implications of our information society? And what can we do to address and prevent them? Our speakers today will touch upon these and many more issues. And information nowadays, it's kind of a hot topic. So we have this trend of misinformation and disinformation where the division between truth and falsehood is being blurred by disinformation and misinformation. We see how it's impacting our democracies and our elections. Social media platforms receive increased criticism for their use of data. And following concerns of data protection, the EU's General Data Protection Regulation came into force in May this year. The Russian hacking of the 2016 US election is changing how we safeguard our democracies, our information, and our elections. High-profile security breaches and hacks happen so often that they've become almost commonplace in today's digital landscape for governments, businesses, and individuals alike. If the problems of security cannot successfully be addressed, what will happen to the perception and future of information? Are we moving towards a future of closed, private networks and less information sharing? Or can we expect a more open and more free information society? Wars are now being waged on central infrastructure. And in the words of Timothy Garton Ash-Reed, and I'll read this so I don't miss anything, developments in information technology and globalized media mean that the most powerful military in the history of the world can lose a war, not on the battlefield of dust and blood, but on the battlefield of world and public opinion. So what are the consequences of increased polarization in social media? Can us versus them thinking online be a threat to stability and to peace? What are the potential consequences for democracy and elections? Is control and restrictions the way to go? Or could crowdsourcing and decentralized communities be the future of innovation and product development? Many questions to tackle. Thankfully, we have 3 distinguished speakers who will join us to talk about these issues and many more. The format of this session will be that I will introduce one speaker at a time, after they're all done speaking, we will have a panel debate. So I will start off by asking them some questions, but then we want to provide you with enough time and space to ask your questions. So already start thinking about questions you might have for our speakers. I'm done, and I now want to introduce our first speaker. It is Katharina Borchert, who's the Chief Innovation Officer of Mozilla, who was previously CEO of Spiegel Online, the online division of one of Europe's most influential magazines, and before that was editor-in-chief and CEO of WAZ Media Group. Give a round of applause for Katharina.
Thank you. I've had the great pleasure of working in different industries, as you just heard, media and technology, and this is really where the topic of the future of information is really where all of this converges. We all carry these amazing little computers that we ridiculously still call phones, even though nobody actually makes phone calls anymore, other than insurance agents. And so we have more information at our fingertips than any other generation before, and yet it is harder than ever before to determine what is actually good information, what is reliable information, who can I trust, and what can I base my decisions on. And this is almost akin to an environmental crisis, a crisis of information pollution. And this pollution of our digital space with misinformation leads us as a people to become increasingly divided. We consume very different information. We base our worldviews and our decisions on completely diverging information, and our perception of reality is so divided that it feels like every 6 months there's less overlap in our perception of reality. And my perception of reality, which I would say is the real reality, is so starkly different from that of people living in other parts of the country. We're about to embark on this tour to the Arctic here, and we see the effects of climate change, the dramatic warming, the peril that this puts our planet in. And yet, we still debate the reality of climate change. We still debate the man-made factors that contribute to it. We don't only debate solutions, we don't only debate better policies, we're still wasting time debating the reality of climate change because our perception of reality is based on such dramatically different information. And I'm telling you nothing new when I say that this rampant spread of misinformation is weaponized by state actors, by individual conspiracy theorists, and it doesn't only stay online. This rampant information pollution has dramatic real-world consequences. There's a study that came out at the end of last year about my home country, Germany, where they looked at the relationship between anti-refugee sentiment online and anti-refugee attacks. And what the researchers found was that if people spend a higher amount than average time on Facebook, that leads to an actual increase of attacks on the ground. And what they found is that this held true regardless of other factors. This is even true in little towns that are rather liberal-leaning and that have like citizen committees that welcome refugees with open arms. They found that if a town has a 1 standard deviation higher per person usage of Facebook than the national average, the attacks on refugees increased by 50%. So we have to be, and you all know that, I'm not a researcher, we all know that we have to be careful and that correlation isn't necessarily causation, but I think the trend that we see here is still deeply disturbing. And research shows that if you spend, or the researchers concluded that if you spend an inordinate amount of time stuck in an echo chamber and you're bombarded by misinformation, this over time subtly alters your perception. It changes your perception of what is right and what is wrong, and it also changes your perception of what is socially acceptable. And all of and many of the factors that usually keep us on the straight and narrow, get altered by when you stay in this filter bubble with a lot of people that share anti-refugee sentiment. And it doesn't have to be outright calls to incitement of violence, because Facebook has invested a lot of money in trying to clamp down on that. It is this subtle, it is all of this misinformation that paints refugees as slightly more criminal, less desirable, using our social welfare systems, that pushes people over the edge and makes them think that outright anti-refugee violence, spitting at people, or even as in one case that the researchers outlined, like actually setting a refugee home on fire suddenly becomes acceptable. And this really is only the beginning. So far, most of the misinformation we encounter online is either text-based or based on images. But there's a dystopian world of so-called deep fakes looming right around the corner. We now have the technical ability at a marginal cost to alter videos, to create very realistic-looking, entirely fake videos. Imagine a future where the trolls do not only have 280 characters on Twitter to disparage you, but where they can easily create a video that makes you do or say horrible things, how easy it is to damage your reputation, to destroy your career or your relationship. I wish that Facebook and Twitter could just simply tweak their algorithms magically and somehow restore sanity and civility to public discourse. But that's not going to happen because it's not that easy. We find ourselves in an incredibly complex mess of our own creation. And yes, technology is a major contributor to this, and technology will be a major contributor to the solution. But whatever the platforms do, whatever big tech does, that alone is not going to save us. Regulation can be an important factor, especially Europeans like regulation, Americans rather not so much, but even good regulation alone won't save us. Fact-checking journalism is incredibly important, and I'm encouraged to see so many fact-checking initiatives spring up all across the world in different languages. But fact-checking alone won't save us either. And the same is true for all of the great initiatives that teach people better digital literacy skills to equip them with the cognitive skills of determining what is reliable information and what isn't. But again, this alone won't save us. And it is really, really easy to become discouraged. But I don't just want to be the doomsday preacher, and I don't want you leaving this room saying, never going to listen to that woman again. She really ruined my day. I hear that a lot, by the way. If there's one thing that I have learned in my career, it is that we as humans have an incredible amount of power if we come together to collectively tackle the big questions and the big problems of our time. And so that leaves me actually more encouraged. I don't know how many of you know that. I work for Mozilla currently, and Mozilla is an open source company. We're the weirdos in Silicon Valley. And being an open source company means that we develop software together with a global community. And the source code for our software and our products and technologies is open. So it's open for everybody to inspect, to reuse and remix under the license. And I see every day, I see the messiness of working with community, but I see the incredible power. Community, global engagement is Mozilla's superpower. Firefox would not exist without the thousands of people out there working with us on improving a browser and anything else that we build every day. Mozilla as a company would not exist if it wasn't at the same time a movement. Many things you have come to rely on in the browser, Mozilla actually invented, like tab browsing, pop-up blockers. But it wasn't the well-paid employees that did it. All of our most popular features came from the community. And we're not the only ones that work like that. NASA, the American Space Agency, has actually spent the last couple of years tackling really, really hard problems related to space travel through crowdsourcing. And they reach people that are experts, they reach people that are not necessarily experts, and they're able through crowdsourcing to suddenly solve problems that their own NASA engineers hadn't been able to solve in years. A young colleague of mine impressed me greatly last year because he's one of the founding members of a Greece foundation called the Libra Space Foundation. And it sounds insane what they set out to do, and that is build an open source satellite. And actually both the hardware they designed and built and the software is open source. And they launched their first satellite called CubeSat in April last year. It is now circling the thermosphere, which is a part of the atmosphere, I've been told. I know many things, but literally nothing about space. And it collects data for scientific research. And I find this incredibly encouraging because this signals a new age of open source powered, citizen-led space exploration. And this gives me hope because if we can do actual rocket science collaboratively, open source, as a crowd, What's keeping us from solving all of the other large issues in the world today? We just need together, and we just need to do it together and find ways of working together. And while the internet is certainly a big part of what got us into this mess, it is also part of the solution that can get us out of this mess, because the internet, for the first time, gives us this opportunity to collaborate at scale. So what can you do individually? How do we get this started? And I'm going to sound a little bit boring, and I'm afraid I'm also increasingly sounding like my own parents, which I hate. But my best advice is, for what you can do every day, is be a responsible consumer. Don't be somebody who mindlessly clicks and shares stuff. What does this mean specifically? It starts with training your critical thinking and fact-checking. Google is actually your friend here. If it sounds too good to be true, or in many cases, if it sounds too bad to be true, it probably isn't true. And it usually takes you 1 or 2 clicks to find a good source that has already debunked something you're about to share. So please don't just simply share stuff. Take that extra minute to fact check everything you come across. And if you fact check it and you've come across blatant misinformation, flag it. All of the platforms, whether Twitter or Facebook, give you the opportunity to flag disinformation, fake news. But don't be a troll. What I mean by that is flag falsehoods. Do not flag opinions you don't disagree with, because that is a common tactic that trolls employ to silence dissenting voices. And we need dissenting voices. We need dialogue. What we don't need is outright lies. Flag those. Help the platforms to become better. And another thing, please don't share conspiracy theories. It sounds obvious, but there's this trend in mainstream journalism currently to pick up on even the wildest and craziest conspiracy theory that somebody has dug up on 4chan or Reddit, thoroughly debunk it, and then publish an article. That sounds great on paper and in theory. In practice, I'm afraid it's not working particularly well, because even sharing something that gets debunked gets the conspiracy theory out into the mainstream, and something always sticks. And this kind of amplification is the oxygen that falsehoods and conspiracies need to bloom and thrive. Don't give them this oxygen, no matter how interesting it might seem. Being a responsible consumer also means holding each other accountable, because nobody else is going to do it. So if you see your friends sharing shit on social media, hold them accountable, talk to them. Don't call them stupid, obviously. Do it in a polite and friendly way, but say, hey, this has been debunked. Here's the article that puts it right. I know this is super annoying. I do it on Facebook all the time. Sometimes I am super discouraged because I feel like I'm wasting my time. I'm never going to change. But we know from research that there is power in repetition. And eventually something will stick. And it is up to us whether the correct facts get the repetition or whether the misinformation gets the repetition. So please gently correct your friends. Correct your grumpy uncle when he shares false numbers about refugee crime again. And just because I think this is videotaped, let me clarify, I do have a grumpy uncle, but he's not on Facebook, so he's not actually sharing false statistics. I don't want this getting back to my family. But the big platforms aren't actually the only places and people that matter. Journalism matters. Good journalism matters more than ever before. At the same time, good journalism is under incredible threat, both from state regulators in many countries, but also because the business model isn't working particularly well. So please, please, I implore you, subscribe to your favorite newsroom. Adopt a journalist. Do something so that journalism can survive and thrive. And I don't need to tell you that this actually costs less than your daily dose of ginger, almond milk, latte, or whatever the vice of choice is for you. Adopt a journalist. And last but not least, break out of your own information bubble. We all live in echo chambers. We all live in information bubbles. It is incredibly important to train our own critical thinking, our arguments, but also our compassion. Make the extra step, reach out, try to understand the hopes and fears of people on the other side of the political spectrum. For example, I've made it a point, which is why my scores on Lyft are so low. Whenever I have a Lyft driver who listens to crazy right-wing talk radio, I really like to talk to them about climate change and feminism and equality. And yes, as I said, I'm not really sure I'm succeeding because my ratings are so low. There's a great project friends of mine at the German newsroom Die Zeit recently started. They build a platform that people can sign up for, and then it matches people from different ends of the political spectrum that live geographically close, and it matches them up to actually meet and hash out their differences in person. For the first experiment they ran last year, they matched 1,200 people and put them together in 600 pairs, and the feedback was overwhelmingly good. And we know from research that having these conversations, confronting people in a polite, face-to-face way, can actually help curb extreme views. And so they're running this again this year. And they're expecting that about 100,000 people will sign up for this. And they're doing this, they're not doing this alone, they're doing this with a whole bunch of other newsrooms in Germany. They're doing this with newsrooms in Switzerland and Italy. And I'd meant to ask beforehand, so I'm going to butcher this terribly, but they're actually partnering with Norwegian publication Morgenbladet and the public broadcaster NRK to launch this in Norway as well in the fall. And the best thing about this, the technology they built to do this is open source. So you can just simply take it, find it on GitHub, reach out to me, I'll send you the link. And it is easily translatable into other languages, and you can start something like this in your own country. Find a newsroom that is interested in doing this together with you if you want to do more. Get your country to talk. Thank you.